You guys having fun? Yeah, okay, we're having fun. Hey, Kami, how are you?
We're added bonus as we wait for our last guest to arrive. I'm going to welcome Jason Grumet back to stage. And Jason's got a lot of thoughts on implementation of the infrastructure bill and the IRA.
Oh, good. Tell us your thoughts on the IRA and the infrastructure bill. And congratulations. Can we tell them what you're going to be doing?
Sure.
Yeah? I mean, is that bad form?
No, I don't know. I mean,
okay.
Everything's awkward.
I mean, we're all living hybrid lives. Jason is the National Clean Power Association?
The American Clean Power Association.
So it's very relevant to today's topic. Jason, who has been so important in building this vital center in Washington, has now been announced as the next president of the American Clean Power Association. So it's very relevant to the question of infrastructure, energy, security. So when you move from this place to over there, what's the first thing you're going to do?
So, I mean, look, it's the same job. It's just a slightly different venue. Country's at an incredible inflection point, right? This is the last decade where we get to say this is the last decade we can do something about climate change. $400 billion check has just been written that the country is not able to cash. And that's because of everything you heard earlier today, just about the democracy's ability to move fast. There's a B.B. King song, I'm built for comfort, but I ain't built for speed. That's a pretty good description of our federal government. So I think there's a tremendous amount of work that just has to be done in order to enable the transition.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, I'm going to ask you a genuine question because I don't know anything. Are we smart enough to know how to invest those dollars in ways that are going to create recurring good returns for the economy without recurring effort? I mean, because there's always the question when you get into industrial policy of, I hate to say the words corruption, but let's say mismanagement of resources, poor deployment of resources. I mean, are we good enough to get beyond the kind of politicization of the flow of that money into the efficient, smart, beneficial use of it? I also lose a lot of friends when I ask this question but I worry that we're sometimes not good enough,
so
actually.
We are good enough to succeed if we want to. And just to put this in a little historical context, 50 years ago, like an Apollo rocket literally burned 3 astronauts to death on the launch pad. And like we mourned, we stiffened our spine, and we put people on the moon because everybody wanted to succeed. I think something that hopefully we can talk with the next guest about is how do we get over the just historically terrible process that Congress just went through to advance the IRA, right? It was the infrastructure bill was a strong bipartisan effort, but the IRA was incredibly partisan by design. And the downside of that is it took a lot of issues that fundamentally have broad-based support and put a partisan sheen on them. And so I think there's a real question, and Tom talked about this, we are going to fail in heroically embarrassing ways if we have any chance of making the big moves necessary for 2050. Well, what's going to happen when those things
happen? As you know, I've interviewed Senator Manchin a lot about this. And one narrative on that is that the Bernie Sanders version of Build Back Better started out as $6 trillion, came down to $3.5, then it was 1.75, and then somewhere end up with like a $500 million bill. On one hand, in one narrative, you would expect, wouldn't the GOP be applauding that? And wouldn't
it was the most substantively bipartisan, politically partisan bill in American history, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it was an energy infrastructure bill, right? And with some significant efforts to address, pharmaceutical costs for a number of, critically burdened Americans. But, if you look back to what Senator Manchin and Murkowski did in 2020, they passed a broad-based energy bill. It was bringing 30 bipartisan bills together. It was the most beautiful process. It lacked for one thing. There was no cash, right? It was a tremendously significant authorizing bill.
Right.
What Senator Manchin basically quietly did was come up with the appropriation to fund that bipartisan bill. But the world doesn't see it that way. And when there are errors in judgment or execution, there's going to be a tremendous amount of public outrage.
Part of the Manchin approach, and I'm going to just be truthful with folks here, was that he saw the permitting element and the appropriations as a single package, that America needed both. But for legislative reasons, you had to process them differently. They were a single deal, and to their credit, Senator Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats, and President Biden agreed with that. Their rank and file didn't, which they're not forced to. But with all of the salutations and celebration of the amount of money that went into clean energy, it looks like the progressive wing of the Democrats didn't remember or understand that it was a package deal, and they're the ones that have said they're not supportive of that permitting bill. And so I'm interested in this. Is there enough realism in this discussion in the Democratic caucus to make progress?
Not yet, but deadlines have an interesting way of kind of focusing the consciousness. And when people start to do the math, there will be a clear appreciation that we have technology, we have resources that we actually cannot implement. And that's not just true for pipelines, it's true for solar and wind and battery storage and sequestration and geothermal and hydro and everything. And I think the issue is that there's been a lot of trauma, right? I think the response from a lot of the environmental community, environmental justice community was, this bill will let more bad things than good things happen, which is just not true, right? 80% of the energy that was built last year was renewable. Making the space broader for building is not going to change that. Now, are there going to be some pipelines? There sure better be, because we are not in the position to move to anything close to 100% renewables in the next 10 years. So we are going to have a transition that actually honors the history and economics of communities across the country. And I think the answer is, can we get there? Not unless people like Senator Sanders and AOC actually do the math and urge people to succeed.
I was taking with Susan, I'm going to pick on you for a minute, but Susan asked these questions that remind me a lot of like I was alive in 1996, folks, and I was watching the Telecom Act. It was very confusing. Went to tons of events, some of which I sponsored at the Economic Strategy Institute, where you'd walk away thinking we hit all the right buttons, but none of us knew anything more. It was one of the most convoluted, constantly churning arenas to look at how do you basically re-regulate or deregulate or look at the different arenas. And I just love the way, Susan, you framed the last question about, how do you begin thinking about this infrastructure and the duties or the products that are generated from it in a smart way and also embed security. So I guess my question to you, at BPC, and I do read your reports, is are we running the risk of creating such a cloud over this process of looking at the forthcoming improvements of the energy infrastructure that we lose sight of what's important?
Yes. So, look, every revolution, if you look at it closely, was a series of evolutionary steps. And that's the reality about how democracy is going to work. But I think we do have to have a broader sense of courage. There are any number of people who once a day proclaim that climate change is the most important challenge of our day, except for anything else they care about. Right? I think that, you actually have to then acknowledge that some other things that you care about are, in fact, less important. We also have to be willing to recognize that our legislative framework is 50 years old. Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. There was an incredible surge of public engagement in environmental things 50 years ago. And now we're trying to solve a completely different problem. And if we are so invested in those aging statutes, just like our aging infrastructure, we're not going to get all the way there.
When you move into your new role and you're focused on clean energy, as you kind of look at the other parts of the energy sector, how do you interact with them? How is it a moral question around your member? I have to ask that.
Time out, right?
I have to ask because there is an element. I have to ask you. You have to do your job.
Yeah. No, but look, it's not. First of all, it's not my job.
Yeah.
But there is a small is beautiful imagination which has nothing to do with solving climate change in the real world. And look, the clean power industry, which I'm learning a lot about, is a big, giant industry that needs to be big wind and big solar and build big things.
Right.
And a major attribute of that industry is it actually can generate a lot of revenue and a lot of economic growth.
Right.
It is not an environmental movement that happens to make a lot of money. And that is just something that I think that transition has happened. It has to happen, I think, in a more public way.
Well, I'll share with you, when I was working for Jeff Bingaman in the 90s, we tried to look at what kinds of tax changes could we make to really help workers deal with the turbocharged economy. And look, tax, and we came up with something called A Corp taxes. That if you're doing these, things to help workers with portable benefits, et cetera, you do it. And with all due respect to Bob Reich, he came out and kind of stole our idea, wrote an article and called it the responsible corporation. And he infused it with these questions of morality, and that then immediately killed our idea. And so, I mean, I think it's part of the same question, which you come in and look at the energy infrastructure and investments. How do you get odd bedfellow supporters for the same goal, right? Which is to get cleaner, stable, better energy. We're going to discuss this with Kathleen McMorris-Rodgers in a moment, but how do we be smart about it, but kind of detoxify the environment so that we can be smart on all ends of the energy environment?
So look, I think almost every significant company in the country and world believes in some version of stakeholder capitalism, right? It's more than just maximizing profits in every 90 days. Welcome, Congresswoman. I will just end.
He is so glad you're here. You saved him from the zinger question.
I will just end with the recognition that the product has to be better, right? If the clean energy revolution is not producing better products,
right,
cleaner, cheaper, more reliable, we are not going to get there in time, right? The reason why people love electric cars, ignore their price tag, they're better.
Yeah.
They're better products. You're not sacrificing to drive a Hyundai Ion, and that's going to have to become the truth for, I think, all the clean energy transition. And with that,
big round of applause, Jason Grumet, President of the Bipartisan Policy Center.